So just in terms of the agenda, if you're attending, then perhaps you're thinking about running your own exercise, but it's your first one and you don't know where to start. Or maybe you've been running them for years and you're just looking to pick up some hints and tips. Either way, hopefully, I can provide some value to you. We'll just go through a short introduction before covering what works well and what hasn't worked well in the past. We've got some learnings from virtual exercise that we've run and attended. And we'll also go through some specific COVID learnings from recent exercises. We'll then do the summary and the question session at the end. So in terms of OSRL and our pedigree, for most of you, I think you probably know, but for the benefit of doubt, Oil Response Limited is the largest international industry-funded cooperative, existing to ensure that oil spills are managed effectively wherever they are in the world by providing preparedness, response and intervention services. Our members represent the majority of the global oil production, comprising roughly around about 160 of what we would say are the most environmentally responsible organisations from areas, sectors, including government, marine and the energy-related business. So, since our inception in 1985, OSRL has either run themselves or been involved with several different exercises, taking best practice from our member companies and applying key learning points globally. We've either been exercise directors or role-played ourselves. Either way, we've been involved in hundreds of these exercises, and we've developed what we would say is a good sense of what works and what doesn't work. I myself have been and run many exercises ranging from small desktops through to full-scale incident management exercises, which lasted days and involved well over 150 people mobilising from at least 6 different countries. So, why exercise? This is a question that we should always ask. I would strongly suggest that exercises can probably be the closest thing you're ever going to get to the real thing. And it's a chance to test your assumptions and your understanding. It can also be a great team building exercise and can bring different functions from the company together in a meaningful and important way. OSRL have been conducting COVID compliant exercises throughout the pandemic. It's our view that we needed to do these exercises, firstly to help maintain people's safety. If we do need to respond, we can do so in a safe manner, but also to ensure that we maintain our currency to be able to respond efficiently and effectively. So the different types of exercises then, we tend to see exercises being driven by the need to either test or to train. Any key objectives will be formed as a result of this aim. Training style exercises tend to be workshops or work-through sessions, which can be run in very slow time and can be stopped any time to allow people to ask questions and check their understanding. So this is really important in a training sort of style format, particularly when groups are new and they're still developing their knowledge and understanding of the incident management process. At the other end of the spectrum, we have testing style exercises, which tend to run in real time, allowing participants to make mistakes, which can then be revisited during the debrief. It really depends on where you are and what you're trying to achieve in terms of the team and the development as to whether you train or test. If it's a new team, it's likely the emphasis on the exercise will be towards training, but if it's a well-honed, well-organised team, the emphasis is probably going to be to test. So some exercise fundamentals. There's probably, I think, everybody that's either been involved in an exercise or run an exercise, you know there's some fundamentals that you need to stick to. Probably the most important thing is to define the purpose and the objectives, followed very, very closely by setting the date. It's so important to set the date and make sure you've got all the right facilities booked. You get that bit right and the rest is easy. The objectives drive a lot of the content. It's really important that you don't have too many objectives. If you can limit them to a maximum 5, then you're more than likely going to guarantee success. If you have any more than that, your exercise can become overly complex and challenging to all those involved. If you haven't seen it already, I can thoroughly recommend IPECA's guide to Horsebill exercises, and we'll make sure a link for that particular publication is sent to you in our follow-up. So, what works well? Okay, well let's go through it. So firstly, realism. All exercises are normally scenario-based, and if you're going to have a scenario, make it a realistic one. In terms of exercise role players, in what we call the simulation cell, or the sim cell, where the exercise truth is driven from, we tend to ensure key roles, such as the vessel master or the offshore installation manager, are played by those that have either been in the roles in the past, who are still there in those particular roles. It's such a technical role and so demanding in terms of the knowledge base. It's actually very difficult to get it right and replicate it if you're not one of those professionals. It makes such a difference to the exercise delegates to be speaking to somebody who's reacting as they would in real life. Real players don't always have to be in the sim cell though. It's usual to invite others to play realistically, but very much depends on what your objectives are, of course. As you can see from the picture, I've been involved and I've involved government entities in the past, and it works very well. But the client, the customer, was in a sufficiently mature place in terms of ability, so that they felt it was okay to make mistakes in front of the regulator. It may be something that you wouldn't perhaps do if you're just beginning the road to building capability. The fabric of realism can take many other shapes. For instance, one exercise I ran involved the use of a chart where we laid miniature vessels, booms, skimmers and various other items of equipment to help people see where everything was and bring the exercise to life. Participants got a really good tangible understanding of resourcing locations and how long it would take for each vessel to arrive in region and what the challenges were along the way. Obviously, you wouldn't use this example in a test style exercise, but it works well if the emphasis is training rather than testing, because people can stop, ask questions, ask why that piece of boom is there, why that vessel is there, but it can be quite a powerful way of showing people where all the resources are. You can also use the exercise to contact external stakeholders such as contractors, as it helps to bring a sense of realism about how long it will take to sign contracts, validate the contact itself and the mobilisation details, and what the various blockers might be. You have to be really clear, though, that it's an exercise, and I'll cover why and in an example later. So, field deployments. I've seen field deployments run both simultaneously and separately. Both of them have got advantages and disadvantages. If you're still developing your teams, it's probably best to separate out the offshore exercise and run it beforehand. That way you can give relative feedback on any incorrect assumptions made, like, it'll be there in 5 minutes, or yes, that piece of kit was maintained last week and it's running really smoothly. It can help. It can also really help if you get comms issues. I had a case in Cameroon where lightning took out the offshore comms system, which was a problem in many ways, of course, as the offshore facility was delivering the injects into the IMT to name but one. So we reverted to the backup, where I then replicated the role of the OIM to keep the exercise going, and this allowed the OIM to sort the problem out. However, if it's done separately, then all of this can be avoided. The dreaded press conference. I love press conferences. I think they're absolutely fantastic for focusing the mind of the individuals being exercised. It really helps to drive the exercise when people know that they're going to be fronting up to cameras very shortly. It can help if the press conference is the very last session of the day, because people are normally mentally exhausted by the end of it. Recording this session can really help, as it gives useful material during feedback later, particularly if exercising your media management is one of your exercise objectives. So, expert advice. Manage the unknowns. Hopefully you've all seen this quote before from Donald Rumsfeld, all about the unknowns. For me, it's really important to pick out 2 points. about the what we call the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. It could mean the difference between doing things right and doing things wrong, as our next slide shows. A few years ago, I attended an offshore exercise in Libya, where we were testing the team's ability to deploy the containment and recovery equipment. This is something the offshore team had done for years without any problems. However, when we came to view the deployment, we realised it would never work. There were 3 challenges. The first was the vessel and the second vessel. The second vessel was too small to effectively pull the boom through the water. The second issue was the location of the boom apex, where the oil collects. It was about 100 metres away from the main vessel, which was too far for the skimmer to reach. There was no way the skimmer's hoses were going to reach all the way back to the apex of the boom in order to collect the oil. A further issue was identified that the connector coming from the skimmer wouldn't fit to the vessel's tanks where they planned to collect the oil, should there be any. So after observing these issues, we made a few recommendations, and the next time we attended the deployment, the issues were fixed, and the team were much more likely to be able to contain and recover the oil effectively. So for me, the question you should always ask yourself is, how am I handling those unknowns and unknowns, those known unknowns and those unknown unknowns? Do I need assistance? A development plan. Most exercises that take place are probably done so in the context of the bigger picture. Most teams don't start off as excellent. In fact, having managed a development plan in the past, I actually found myself spending the first few sessions just correcting mistakes, incorrect assumptions, and a general lack of confidence, which was largely due to poor leadership from the previous incumbent. If you are designing these exercises, you're probably trying to weave a number of considerations into play if you haven't done so already. Elements including checking the capability, are the teams ready for the test phase, what are the priorities, are there any complementary activities that we need to include, what about mandatory regulatory exercises, are there any rota issues, how are we going to ensure all the teams in the rota get those equal experiences, and then how do we onboard new team members with new team members with very little experience compared with those that have got lots of experience. Lastly, the debrief. I've found that over the years it's important to keep the debrief fairly short. People are normally tired after the exercise and brains can be frazzled. The tried and tested system of 3 good and 3 bad points for improvement always seems to work well. Capturing feedback points on a screen in real time can save a lot of time and minimise misunderstandings later on, as everybody gets to see the feedback on the screen as it's written, which can then go into the main report. Excuse me. Of course, it doesn't capture the feedback from those people that don't want to say anything in a large crowd. Sometimes dinner after the exercise can be extremely productive in helping people to communicate those further issues. There's also other tools like SurveyMonkey, but people normally move on quite quickly to the next work-based challenge and don't really have time to fill in the survey. If you can hold a post-exercise workshop to deliver and endorse the action plan, then that can be really, really helpful. So, on to what hasn't worked so well in the past then. Firstly, let's cover time jumps. I've never had any success in working with time jumps. In my experience, most incidents generate a huge amount of information and always need several discussions and decisions. I was once asked to deliver a time jump during an exercise in New Zealand. The client insisted this would be a good idea. However, there were too many people involved to control all the information, and the exercise became really confusing as people struggled to work out what had been decided and where the equipment was and why. In the end, the exercise was productive because we got to test other aspects such as communications and understanding of the plan. But if I'd had my time again, we wouldn't have used those time jumps at all. It really depends in my mind what the objective is, but my suggestion is that there are other ways to achieve the aim, which I would say is probably of taking people past the first day and past the first few hours, which we always seem to test in an exercise. I ran a 3-day exercise for a client in Indonesia, and at the end of each day, the incident management team would provide a handover to the oncoming shift for the next day. That way, all the information was available, there was clarity over decisions and documentation such as the incident action plan for the next operational period. That was all in place and it all made sense. So this next exercise this next example, it doesn't come from OSRL, it comes whilst working for a different organisation, but I think it's really, really important to talk about. This is set in context of the Inaminus attack, which for those that don't know, I'm sure most of you do to be honest, was an incident that occurred in 2013. Very sadly, nearly 70 people lost their lives, a mixture of employees and terrorists. And this sadly this event took place in Algeria at BP and Statoil's facility in the desert. I was working for a company at the time who were very close to the Inaminus facility, and basically there was one road going past our site, which led straight to the Inaminus facility. And so we obviously we had to treat this very seriously, and a massive amount of action took place both during and after the event. What you can see here is a replication of what happened next. The HSE manager at the time thought it was a really good idea to a few months later to practice this particular scenario. Of course, everybody was still extremely tense. We had a lot of discussions about what we would do, but he decided to test everybody and see exactly how they'd react. So he wrote, as you can see, this is a very important message. There are terrorists outside the front security gate. We're under attack. He handed it to the drilling manager and let things play out. Unfortunately, the drilling manager at the time didn't see the very small message at the bottom that said this is an exercise, and he went straight into react mode. And it was only probably something like 2 hours into the incident that I think the HSE manager at the time realised that something was wrong and said to everybody, "You do realise this is an exercise, don't you?" You can imagine everybody's faces. It wasn't a particularly pretty sight, and really didn't go well. So I think really what I want to draw everybody's attention to here is this point about tunnel vision and inattentional bias. It's really important teams are aware of tunnel vision during exercises. Another example, in 1995, Kenneth Conley, he was a Boston police officer, and he was convicted of perjury and obstruction because he'd been chasing a subject and hadn't noticed a group of policemen beating someone up, even though he ran past them just a few meters away. There's a lot more to the story, but the key point here is that Conley thought that he didn't see the fight, and so the jury decided he must have been lying. However, a researcher by the name of Chris Shabry put the alibi to the test and conducted his own experiment. For 2 years, he asked volunteers to follow somebody jogging and count the number of times that jogger touched their head as they jogged. What a lot of people didn't know was that there was a staged fight in broad daylight right next to the path. Unbelievably, 40% of those following the jogger didn't see the staged fight, and Chris Shabry proved it was plausible that the police officer, Kenneth Conley, had suffered from inattentional bias. Another thing to consider is technology. Some years back, the French train company SNCF fell victim to the challenges of technology. They were running an exercise and were testing aspects of media management. This scenario was a deadly train incident involving the tragic loss of life of many people. They put the details, what they believed was on the back end of their website, but what they didn't realise was that the website was published and available to the public. It was only when they started to get calls and emails from journalists for real did they know they'd made a mistake. So it's really, really important in all communications, whether verbal, vocal or visual, that the words exercise are clear and in bold and in red throughout. So complexity. Virtual platforms have brought about a new level of complexity, and we'll talk about the lessons learned from virtual exercises very shortly. I've certainly seen cases in the past where exercises have tried to be overly ambitious. Groups haven't limited the objectives, and the exercises try to drive forward with levels of complexity to overwhelm the attendees. One such exercise in Jakarta proved that point when the teams were working with a particular software platform, which I can only describe as being all-consuming and demanded a lot of brain power. The scenario included a deliberate safety problem for them to solve, but nobody seemed to be able to make the decision to stop the response. During the exercise, we discussed this point, but exercise participants felt very strongly that they were too busy to complete the tasks and deliver and try and work through the software at the same time. If this had been a real event, then lives could have been lost, and it was a really important learning point for us all. So if you can, as I've mentioned before, if you can limit the number of objectives to a maximum of 5, and if you can try and make them complementary, such as testing the interaction between industry and government and testing your media response, because it's likely you'll need input from either industry or government, then that'll make a huge difference to you and your teams. So on to virtual exercises then. Over the last 6 months, we've been involved in a large number of virtual exercises. I mean, to be honest, there are so many learnings from the past 6 months that it probably warrants its own webinar. But here's a short summary to get the ball rolling. In our experience, it's really important the organisations have their processes in order before conducting the exercise, as these virtual platforms, we would suggest, can act as amplifiers of poor process. So if you haven't got your house in order, it's really going to show what the problems are. There's a wide variety of communication platforms which exist in any virtual exercise. The main platforms, such as Microsoft Teams or Zoom, which are very, very useful in terms of functionality. Some groups have made the mistake in the past of treating these platforms like glorified conference call facilities and not really taken advantage of the various functions such as breakout rooms, group announcements and file storage facilities. There can, however, be an overload of information, as in addition to the main platform, there can also be Skype for individual discussions, WhatsApp groups for the SimCell people, telephone calls, conference calls, VHF radio for field deployments, emails, texts, the list goes on. So much so it can quickly be overwhelming for those involved. Good IT is critical. Most people need at least 2 screens to cope with the various platforms. We do know people that have tried to use just an iPad in the past, but the layers of information become overwhelming and confusing to navigate through. Headsets, sound quality is really important during calls. Those headsets are an advantage, and if you do lose your connection, then you really do need an extremely good deputy who can suddenly pick up where you dropped off at a moment's notice. A new key function within the Incident Command System or Incident Management System organisation is a virtual ICS or IMS facilitator. This function is needed so they can run all the IT elements and take the pressure off the planning section chief. There are lots of issues this function will need to take care of, such as people appearing in breakout rooms where they shouldn't be, some people not muting themselves, bringing background noise into conversations and disrupting communications. It's noted as well that some people start the day on mute, but as time goes on, people forget and don't put themselves on mute. So it's great to have that IMS facilitator that can sort all those issues out. Whilst the breakout rooms are very good, there is a tendency towards what we call the silo effect. Information by osmosis doesn't really work in the same way that it does when you're there face to face. It's difficult to observe everything. The information centre is critical, and we use iBoards, which we've developed to ensure the key information is captured in a methodical fashion. We've seen situations which we've participated in virtual exercises where no actions, timelines, decisions have been recorded. No costs have been monitored. This is obviously highly problematic because if this had happened in a real event, then all that key information wouldn't have been captured, which then later on would have been a real issue. If these iBoards had been available, then I'd like to think the situation would have been very different. Lastly, virtual exercises do bring a layer of complexity, as previously mentioned. There can be a lot of those platforms to cope with, effectively resulting in a situation where what we would use the phrase, the cart leading the donkey. So the platforms are driving the people rather than the people driving the platforms. There can also be screen fatigue, as users are likely to be focused on multiple screens, which in itself can be mentally exhausting, being constantly on the go. Long exercises, we would suggest for virtual platforms, are ambitious, so it's important to make sure you look after your teams, take breaks, and get some fresh air between meetings. So moving on to COVID-19 response learnings, we've been conducting several multi-agency exercises since the outbreak of the pandemic. And we've taken some really interesting learnings relating to COVID, which we very much like to share with you. In terms of COVID, it's accelerated and accentuated many issues. Any major spill would always bring significant challenges, particularly in remote and rural parts of the world. But when combined with the current pandemic, it can bring a whole new level of complexity. In terms of logistics, it wouldn't be a good idea to rely on any service or provision normally expected to be provided locally. For example, food, catering, laundry, fuel for generators, even the services of a local garage if a vehicle needs repair. A lot of maritime-based response activities do rely on third-party vessels to enable equipment and people to be deployed. It's been noted that some island ferries have stopped during COVID, effectively raising the drawbridge and stopping third parties from visiting. Chartering that ferry or obtaining another boat would also depend on the willingness of the crew, but it's possible they might not want to take part. COVID has changed so many aspects of life that we used to take for granted. In the UK, we've got something called the Secretary of State's Representative, or what we call the SOSREP, who has a wide range of powers at sea and can direct and command a vessel. However, it's very unlikely they could compel a crew to carry out instructions if they're refused on the grounds of COVID-19 safety. Similarly, if oil were to impact the shoreline, it's unlikely the SOSREP or indeed any other agency has the prerogative to commandeer shore-based assets such as hotel accommodation. If the owner refused, the only way hotels could be commandeered is in the national interest, would be to invoke a UK Act, which is part of the Civil Contingencies Act, which is possible, but we would suggest extremely unlikely. The COVID-19 fear factor needs to be taken into account. The pandemic has certainly brought out the best, but also the worst in people. And here's a few examples raised during one exercise. A care worker employed in a care home, which has had cases of COVID-19, despite living locally and being a member of the local community, was told by the owner of the local shop she wasn't welcome on the premises and must shop elsewhere. Another care worker employed in the care home was followed home by a person who was later observed spraying the care worker's garden gate with disinfectant. And a third example, what we call the NHS, which is our National Health Service. An NHS key worker, not from the area, was the victim of threatening behaviour, requiring police intervention because she was assumed to be a tourist, breaking lockdown restrictions by staying in self-catering accommodation. It's salient to note that all three examples date from a time when those workers were being lauded as heroes in the national paper newspapers and applauded on the streets. With this level of fear circulating locally, one can maybe anticipate how a team of all spill responders arriving in a small remote community would be received without careful management. If the pollution incident is large or complex, several responders may be international experts, foreign citizens or others who have recently travelled from abroad, perhaps from a country which has or is perceived to have a much higher incidence of COVID-19 than the affected area. Perhaps their arrival coincides with local food shortages and panic buying. Perhaps there's an outbreak in a local care home a few days after they arrive. It could be completely unconnected, but there's many potential areas of tension. For us, the response is much more than removing the oil. Community liaison and engagement has always been an important subject. The above comments previously described hopefully underline the importance of getting the local community on your side, of working collaboratively with them, communicating with them, and most significantly, reassuring them that the pollution response is being conducted in a responsible way and that all measures to mitigate the spread of the virus and protect the safety of the community are being taken. It's also about leaving an indelible positive mark on the community. The hearts and minds approach may sound contrived, but it's as critical to a successful response as a clean beach. A key recommendation from one exercise was the appointment of a specific COVID single point of contact, or SPOC, stakeholder liaison function. Their purpose would be to handle all liaison, both internal and external, relating to COVID-19 and the incident. They can monitor and oversee specific issues relating to COVID, issues such as those we've highlighted. So, in conclusion, is there any such thing as a bad exercise? Well, I would say no. Well, apart from the example I gave you for Inaminas, but as long as you follow some key rules such as being clear on the aim, setting the date, creating that sense of realism, managing the unknowns, getting expert advice, avoiding time jumps, being really clear it's an exercise, recognising complexity and the challenges it brings, and using those virtual platforms, you'll do a great job. So really, for me, there's no such thing as a bad exercise. I would suggest that it can be bad follow-up. If there will almost certainly be a number of actions identified as a result of the exercise, and it's really important to capture those actions and those learnings, and then to follow up and do something about it. Because if you don't do the follow-up and then repeat the same learnings next time round, then yes, that can be a problem. So just on to questions then. If I can just refer to Mandy to see if we've got any questions from the group.
There's nothing in yet, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, they can put them in just now. Okay.
I think I can see one actually. Can you elaborate on time jumps? No problems at all, Paddy. That's absolutely a great question. So these time jumps, what they're used for is to try and accelerate the scenario. So an example would be you start the scenario off and you do all the things that you normally do. So you start to mobilize people and you get them in the room and you make the telephone calls to all those people that are going to be involved to say, right, we've had an incident, this is an exercise, we've had an incident, etc., etc. So a lot of exercises tend to get through the first 4 hours and then stop. And I think a lot of groups recognise, we just keep testing the same thing over and over again. But what about all the complexities that come after a few days? So what's happened in the past is, to solve that particular issue, they say, okay, well, we'll do the first 4 hours, we'll get everybody going, and then what we'll do is we'll say, right, we'll stop, everybody can have a break for half an hour, and then when they come back, it's going to be 3 days later, and we're going to start the exercise off from there. So hopefully that helps in terms of explaining what a time jump is.
We have a few more good questions coming in. Mark is asking if you've come across a virtual platform that stands out from the others for efficient exercises.
I think that's a great question, actually, Mark. I think the two that really sort of stand out are the ones mentioned, Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Both have got really great functionality. I think particularly probably Zoom has got that ability to pull people in and out of those breakout rooms. I know Teams is catching up on that capability, but it's also got sort of functionality of polling and works really well. So for me personally, I think those two are in the lead. And
Taryn's asking, when more at the training phase, is it reasonable to have the scenario more widely distributed to allow for better planning, preparation, procedures, and injects?
That's a great question, actually, Taryn. Yes, very much so. And it really does depend on where you are in the testing phase, training phase. If you're in the early stages, very early stages, and you just want to instill confidence and build knowledge with groups and individuals, absolutely, I see no reason why you can't present the scenario beforehand to really sort of enhance learning and discussion. Because you're not trying to surprise anybody in that sort of situation. You're really just trying to engender dialogue and communication. So in the very early stages, I would definitely advocate sharing the scenario. But as time and people's experience progresses, I'd start to withdraw that sort of that level of knowledge. Great question there. Thank you. Good. Have we got any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more from Paul. On time jumps, more of a comment than a question, but sometimes they're unavoidable depending on the nature of the exercise. So sometimes they're needed, but well noted that care is taken to ensure that everyone time jumps together.
Yeah.
From Paul.
That's a really good point, Paul. I know we've worked together on exercises in the past, and I know Paul's got a lot of experience in this particular area. Absolutely, I think you've got to go into overdrive. I think to replicate that level of information and detail, and then make sure that everybody's informed and updated. So it's a huge task to do. Yeah, thank you. Do we have any more?
Anya's asking, during a tabletop exercise, how do you make sure people are completely disconnected from outside world and practices they are used to?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. Completely disconnected, yeah. So there's sometimes the day job going on, isn't there? I think it's less challenging in a face-to-face context. I think it's more challenging in a virtual platform because people are like ourselves today. A lot of us are at home. There's probably things going on, emails coming in. We're multitasking. I think that's a great point, actually. And I think there's only so much that we can do in that sort of virtual world to allow for that. Obviously, we can make the scenario really interesting and realistic. That really helps because it really engages people and draws them in, and they get a real sense of achievement when they solve the problem, if you like, and they have that sort of sense of realism. So sometimes it can just be giving people enough to do and making it sort of all-consuming for them. That really helps. But yeah, absolutely, in a virtual context, it can be a real challenge. Just keeping those people present and engaged. So yeah, great question. Thank you. So I think that looks like all the questions, Mandy.
It looks like that might be it for questions. Unless anyone has any.
Looks good.
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully everybody's found this webinar really informative and enjoyable. If you are planning on running your own exercise, I hope this session has given you the hints and tips that you need to give it a go. If you want some help with Donald Rumsfeld's unknowns and you feel like this could be achieved through an exercise, please get in contact via my OSRL email address that you can see, or use the Contact Us facility on our website. Equally, if you need to run an exercise but you don't have the time, then feel free to get in contact and we can get to the nub of what you need quickly and easily. I hope it will be a fun and interesting experience for all. Thanks very much.